Georgia is the front line of this fight between freedom and authoritarianism. And if the freedom falls in Georgia or in Ukraine, then there are going to be next countries which come next. And please don't make that happen.
Maybe one day or at some point, I also be part of researching Georgia, what happened here. But I think that the first and foremost, we have to save Georgia from becoming a fully fledged dictatorship.
There should be some kind of, Gandalf, which arrives on the white horse in Lord of the Rings and saves us.
What is the future of Georgia's economy and what does it mean for a regular Georgian, not for the extremely rich, not extremely poor, but something in the middle?
Economy, yes, it's nominally growing, but what is more important for ordinary Georgian citizens is if their standard of living is improving or not. And the reality is that it's not improving.
In the 21st century, United Kingdom has had 8 prime ministers. 7 out of these 8 prime ministers graduated from Oxford. Can you guess the one who didn't? Hello and welcome to Talk Georgia, which is my English podcast covering Georgian and regional politics. To do so, today we're joined by Mr. Sandro Zibzibadze, an activist, protester, freedom fighter, a trainer. He's founder of the Georgia's Future Academy, co-founder of the Franklin Club, visiting professor at University of Georgia, former executive director at Girchimo Freedom Party. He worked at British Embassy, also Ministry of Economy. To put it in a nutshell, clear-cut deep state agent. But the key reason why I invited Sandro to join us here on Talk Georgia is that he just graduated from world-famous Oxford University. Now he holds an MPP, a Master of Public Policy from Blavatnik School of Government, Oxford University. And basically he ended up in Oxford from the heart of Rustaveli protest to the heart of the Oxford University. So please feel free to add anything to my limited introduction, but my first question would be that what was the transition like?
Yeah, first, thank you for inviting me and having me. I've been watching your podcasts from Oxford, and it was always very interesting episodes. Concerning your question, basically, this Oxford story, I kind of had a dream for quite a long time.
Who wouldn't?
But, it was very defined. Like some people would want to go to Harvard or some people want to go to Stanford or something. For me, it was Oxford for some reason. And the reason was that I spent 2 months in 2008 as in summer program in Oxford when I won one of the high school competitions. And I thought that I wanted at some point to study here. And then when I returned to Georgia and was working in different agencies and organizations, which some of you have mentioned, each year I was kind of delaying my application because something was happening. It was Gavrilov night, then we had COVID, then there were 2020 elections as well, and so on. So I was constantly delaying applying. And finally, in 2023, I felt like maybe now was the time. I knew that my organization would do the observation mission. We were preparing to also mobilize pro-European young Georgians to actually participate in elections, to do some kind of mobilizing efforts for them. And all of that was kind of secured and work in progress. The Russian law was defeated for the first time. And I thought maybe it was now a good time to apply and do this 1-year degree. So I did apply through the Chimning Scholarship, which is the British government scholarship to support young people who want to get a high-quality education in UK. And in March 2024, I received a scholarship and admission to University of Oxford, and I felt okay, maybe now was time to go. Still, it was a very hard decision because since then, in about 2 or 3 weeks, the Georgian government reintroduced the Russian law again, which were followed by 2.5 months of protests on Rustaveli Avenue and beyond, and I was extremely actively involved. I think.
So you were one of the organizers of those
Yes,
protests,
that's how it happened. In 2023, I was less involved, but in 2024, we had a big youth network, a lot of activists who I worked with, and we felt, okay, now we can help with organizing. So some of the logistical stuff, some of the specific organizational tasks the protests require, like, I don't know, to put the stage, to put the music, even some of the songs, which are now very popular in Georgian society. I personally selected them and recorded them on USB stick, which then everyone was singing for a couple of months. And then it was a very hard choice because the elections were coming. It was clear that the Georgian dream was gonna pass the Russian law despite the protests. They finally did, and I had the choice either to stay in Georgia and not to go to Oxford, or to go to Oxford nevertheless. And more so complicated the choice was that at that time, from 4 major Georgian opposition blocs, 3 were trying to recruit me to run for parliament as well, with quite high positions in the lists and so on. But I felt that at that time I would be more valuable in the civil society, as the observation effort was very important. And also the Oxford term was starting on the 29th of September, just about 1 month before the election. So I felt that I would be able to go to Oxford, then maybe come back, and which I did for elections for 2 weeks, and continue my studies in Oxford. So I think I made a good choice in the end, not running for parliament. Some of my friends did, and then soon after the elections, all of them had to put down their mandates, right? So that's, I think it was a good, transition-wise, it was very hard, because soon after the elections, we all know the famous Kobakhidze statement and all the big protests in December and January which followed, and it was very hard emotionally to be away and look how many of my friends, students, people I know were beaten, brutally beaten, arrested, and we've never seen such scale of brutality from the Georgian police before. Like, I've been involved and participated in many protests, not only during GD, but also during Saakashvili's time as well, for some of the stuff. And I've never seen personally such scale of brutality, which happened in December 2024. And we all know about the BBC investigation as well, and there are a lot of allegations. But even without the potential use of chemical weapons or some other chemicals, legal or illegal, in water cannons, in general, the way police treated the protesters was in extreme brutality. So it was hard, but at the same time, this transition was also eye-opening. I finally had some time to sit down and read some books and articles which I wanted to read for years, and also to think about my future, the future of my organization, the future of my country, a little bit kind of zoomed out, because always I was part of the process, and it's very hard. Like, when you're involved in it, you can always do some tactical work, and you can look at the small details which you need to fix and do, and you never have like this time to sit down and read and think as much as you would like. And I think the Oxford gave me also this chance to look to the process of Georgia a little bit more kind of from the strategic perspective than from the tactical perspective.
Okay, let me ask you about that. I mean, I was thinking to ask you about future plans, so what now? But you touched a very interesting aspect of zooming out from Georgia a little bit, and I know that it is very difficult because, again, when I want to go to sleep, it is difficult to switch off my head, and right. So when right from the heart of the protest, when you go somewhere as quiet as Oxford, so I think it must have been quite a change. But my question to you is this: again, you left Georgia when it still was a developing democracy in a way, so young democracy with a European prospect, the country with the candidate status to the European Union. And when you came back from Oxford, which is like a year after, now you ended up in a country which is increasingly authoritarian, with no European prospects, almost a dictatorship. Again, so the list is long, but my question to you is that when you zoomed out, so did you see something that you wouldn't have been able to see if you stayed here in Georgia? Or would would you have any ideas? Okay, or maybe so. Would you have corrected some of those steps or actions that the Georgian politicians and had you stayed in Georgia, probably you would have been part of it. So what would you have done differently?
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, when I was already leaving, I started to talk about this with many European allies as well as American allies, but most importantly with many people in Georgia, that I felt that authoritarianism was coming way before. I think it became very evident and clear for many people this year and maybe a little bit last year, especially after the European integration was halted by the regime. But before that, you can see that they were like planning. And I'm a lot into comparative politics, so for many years I was watching what was going on in Russia, in Belarus, and many other places, and it was very hard not to see a lot of signs and how the government was capturing institutions one by one, how the opposition was being marginalized, constantly bullied on their propaganda, and that's a big problem for us now because many of them, it's very hard, like we don't have we always ask this, who are the leaders, but that's I think the result of this constant propaganda and marginalizing efforts of the regime, which the same is happening in all other authoritarian states. And the same was happening with Rustaveli case when I think which was a very important in the retrospective, in the big picture, because before Rustaveli existed, it was kind of balanced in terms of media when you had the big media government propaganda, but also you had a critical media which was on par with the media. After the Rustaveli was gone, we never managed to recover in terms of media as well. But yeah, so just to clarify, I felt that authoritarianism was coming. It had a lot of signs, but yeah, it was kind of officially declared and became evident after I left. So yeah, today Georgia is way more authoritarian. What I have seen, maybe some of the things I was kind of feeling, but one, I felt that we are constantly, I call this pro-European or pro-democracy forces in Georgia. And when I say that, I include opposition parties, but also the civil society, as well as activist groups, and in general, people who want pro-European democratic Georgia in the future. I feel that we're constantly in some kind of reactionary mode. And that became even more clear. It's very rare when our side is creating the agenda. And when I was thinking about it from Oxford, maybe there are two cases during the last 5, maybe even 10 years. One was this Russian law protests, when it was for the first time, and even that was in a way reactionary because the government obviously introduced it, but at least at that time, pro-European forces were setting the agenda, and even the GD supporters I was talking to, they were calling it Russian law, because that kind of became the mainstream narrative for it.
Yeah.
And then,
in terms of propaganda, I mean, they lost it for sure, at least for
the first time.
For the first time.
Yeah.
For the second time also, but they used just force, brute force.
Yeah. And then also, I think the second case, which in terms of propaganda they also lost, was this 1st of October case. Maybe some popular opinion, but also I think that time, the 1st of October, people managed to somehow create this narrative. I think the second problem was that maybe there was not much planning and other parts which you need to successfully do this type of protest. But in terms of narrative in media, it was for the first time, everyone on the 1st of October, even the GD supporters, they were not really waiting for election results or what would happen in terms of elections, but all of them were waiting what would happen on Rustaveli Avenue, and that became kind of 2 cases which I can recall. That's one thing. So we're constantly in reactionary mode, and I think it's very important to start doing politics. And to start doing politics, we should be setting the agenda, not constantly responding. And we constantly respond, then the government has an advantage. That was one thing. The second thing, which also became even more clear and evident for me, that many Georgians, especially the ones who are fighting for a European future, and getting all those sacrifices, but also they have extremely high hopes and sometimes feel dependency on the West. So it's there should be some kind of, Gandalf, which arrives on the white horse in Lord of the Rings and saves us. So I think that's something which you can see even more when I was kind of zooming out and listening, and you can feel that. And everyone was asking me, okay, what is the UK doing? What kind of sanctions they're going to do and stuff. So I think, of course, the support of our Western allies is important, but we have to do most of the job ourselves. And I was always telling to many people, because a lot of my friends, they'll be, okay, Georgian future depends on Ukraine. Like if the war in Ukraine ends favorably for Ukraine, everything would be fine with Georgia. And I never shared this optimism because I said it could be that Ukraine wins and becomes European democratic country, but Georgia can still stay, I don't know, some kind of Cuba, or some kind of these examples, right? There are those examples. So it depends on our fight. So that's the thing. And the third thing, this big fragmentation. That one I also felt when I was in Georgia already. I was supporting the united list for opposition for 2024 elections. I thought that it was the best case scenario because it would allow the sharing of resources. Also, in general, the people I was talking to and my organization, like we traveled through almost all municipalities in Georgia, we're talking to people. People wanted to see a strong alternative. It was very hard to have like fragmented 3 or 4 opposition groups, and nobody felt that, like it was one and polling at 40% or something, very close to GD, I think would be a different story. Also, then all the opposition, instead of some infightings and competing with each other for votes, they will be all focused on fighting with GD. So I felt that that was a necessity, and unfortunately opposition didn't do it. I still believe that was a big mistake. But even after that, I think it fragmented even more. Even like those alliances which we had, this 4 of them, they're now like split even more. Like if you look, for example, in Gaharia, a lot of people left him. If you look at Lelo, the Freedom Square left Lelo, Tolidze also left Lelo. So even like this 4 groupings, now we have maybe like 10 or 11. And so and it's the same when it comes to civic activist groups and civil society. During the Russian protests, we somehow managed to, it was not easy, but to at least coordinate and to put everyone on the same table and discuss what's going to be the further steps. And at this point, I feel that it's completely no coordination at the moment, and I think that's what benefits the regime as well. So that's something which goes back to another of your questions, why I came back to Georgia. Because a lot of people say that I'm crazy, why should I come back? The government propaganda is constantly bashing us. We are under investigation by the so-called anti-corruption agency, which is being now cancelled, but still their function's going to move to another organization.
So we are too, by the way, I think I remember kind of crossing you when in the run-up of the elections, we were doing Vote for Europe movement, basically, and this anti-corruption agency also started case against us, which is in court now.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, like for many people, maybe a rational choice would have been to stay in UK or move to US or stay somewhere in Europe. I had like a lot of options. Maybe continue some academia path as well, do some PhD, or start working in some organizations. Like a lot of think tanks now, especially in Europe, want this experience of living under potential pro-Russian regimes and seeing, because Europe finally starts to see Russia as a big emerging threat. But then I felt like that a lot of my friends, my colleagues, my students were in jail and under threat and fighting. And also I felt like some moral responsibility because many of those people got involved because of me talking about democracy or importance of European integration, doing lectures and so on. But secondly, also that I felt that there's this need of this coordination. I felt that I could maybe play some part in helping activists, at least, and some opposition forces to coordinate better. That's why I came back.
You mentioned a very interesting thing here. So the Georgia is indeed very interesting case to research, because this astounding speed of the consolidation of the authoritarianism and turning to dictatorship, from, well, at least the most democratic country in the region and beyond. But I would rather save Georgia before I research it. So maybe one day or at some point, I also be part of researching Georgia, what happened here. But I think that the first and foremost, we have to save Georgia from becoming a fully fledged dictatorship. My follow-up question, what you said, when you went to Oxford and you came back, quite a lot of changes have happened. And you said that you saw the signs that this would be coming. Maybe not this fast, but still, signs were there clearly. If we look ahead, 1 year ahead, so what do you see coming?
Yes, that's a good question, and also I don't want to draw a gloomy picture.
And you said that
especially
the parties kind of fought each other, they segmented. do you see that the regrouping of the parties, or there will be no parties?
Well, I think I will put it that way. If
Yeah.
the status quo remains as it is, I think the result would be very bad. I see if we don't change anything, I think the authoritarians would consolidate even further. So I think at some point we see already the signs, right? The regime wants to ban opposition parties. They would tighten even more the grip of power. So yeah, I think at some point probably they would also start maybe arresting and doing real legal cases against civil society organizations as well, not just administrative ones, and so on. So it doesn't look good in these terms. And also, if you look at international conjuncture and international politics and geopolitics, it's also not really favorable for Georgia at the moment, in my opinion. But then it always depends on us, right? So if we manage to regroup, if we manage to create at least some kind of coordination efforts and platforms, and there are examples of this. This has been done in Georgia before the so-called Rose Revolution in 2003. It was done in Georgia even by Ivanishvili in 2012 himself, right? He managed to unite all the opposition and to coordinate and do things, even maybe not even coordinate, but even like put them under himself, right, fully. Maybe we don't need that at this point, but at least coordination efforts when people work together, when also our international partners, who I sometimes talk to, and one of the biggest questions is always like, who is representing you? Like, who is representing the Georgian people who are on the streets, who are pro-Europeans, and they never, there's no clear things because there's so many different groups, it's very hard for them. So at least some kind of coordination mechanism which would coordinate the political processes in Georgia and try to be more proactive, not always reactive, but also like the ones who will be talking to our Western partners as well, who would finally have, okay, these are maybe 2 or 3 or maybe 10 people, but at least those people are the one who represent this Georgian pro-European forces or pro-Western forces or pro-democracy forces, however like. So I think that's very important and depends on us. If we manage to do those things, then we may reverse the course. If not, I think the picture will become even darker and darker. But still, I think the good thing is that I don't, in long term, like in a big picture, I don't see the potential that Georgia would become a Russian puppet state. Like if that's looking at the Russian economy, the Russian society and stuff, I think it's kind of this the last song of a dove, basic, or like swan, basically, for the Russian Empire. Because if you look at all the resources they have, yes, they have like these ambitions and the historical past. Yes, they have nuclear weapons, maybe which is like the biggest asset they have. But in terms of economy and stuff, it would be very hard for Russia to recreate the empire. So I think in long term, for sure, the democracy and freedom in Georgia would prevail. But I think, on the other hand, if you take the words from famous economist, that we don't live for like in long term, we live all in short term, right? So if you look at the Keynes, basically, yes, many of people, we don't want to wait 30 or 40 years or 20 years or 10 years, right? So we want our European future as soon as possible. And I want, for example, for my parents and for my older generation also to see Georgia being part of EU and also NATO maybe at some point, even though the NATO is now fully off the agenda. But, you know, things change many times. So I think that's, in the big picture, I don't see that Georgia losing its fight for freedom. I think the eventual history would give us justice at some point. The Russian idea and, in general, the totalitarian or authoritarian tendency would be defeated here. Georgia is a culturally European nation in many ways, but it depends on us when that happens. And if we continue the way we do now, I think then it will take longer. And if we change some things, we can do it faster.
Okay, before we move to, the current developments of Georgia and maybe a little bit more on geopolitics, my question is that how about your plans? Because again, you partly kind of touched it while talking, but again, now you Oxford graduate, that gives you a whole lot of perspectives. And you mentioned that, well, some people may prefer Harvard or some other universities. If you're interested in politics or if you're interested in public administration or serving public, I think Oxford University is unique in a way that, well, it's not because that it is the oldest university in the English-speaking world, but I'm a big fan of British politics. So in the 21st century, United Kingdom has had 8 prime ministers. 7 out of these 8 prime ministers graduated from Oxford. Can you guess the one who didn't?
In 20th century?
21st century.
21st century. The one who didn't, maybe Keir Starmer? Or no? But
Well,
he also, I think he
but
went
he
to
is-
Oxford.
he went to Oxford,
yeah. Liz Truss also went to Oxford.
Yeah.
Boris Johnson also went to Oxford. David Cameron also went to Oxford. Tony Blair also
Did
went to...
go. He studied law in
yeah,
Oxford.
he also... So maybe then the Gordon Brown.
That's right. So Gordon Brown was the only prime minister who didn't go to Oxford. And if you take a look at the 20th century, the Oxford produced more prime ministers in the UK than all other universities taken together. So let alone that Oxford produced at least 28 Nobel Prize winners and all. Yeah. So, I mean, again, if you want to go into politics, the Oxford is the absolutely right place. So where are you going with your Oxford degree? Now?
Yeah, well, first I feel that why I came back to Georgia, because as you mentioned, and I feel the same way, I see a lot of people leaving, and that happens around me all the time, like a lot of friends and a lot of people who I was working with, a lot of activists. They're leaving. A lot of people are preparing to leave. A lot of people are moving away from the fight and going to private sector or just trying to solve their personal, financial, other issues. And I felt that, like sometimes you have to go against the flow. So I thought maybe with at least my example, that's one thing. Then the second thing is I felt that, this coordination effort was necessary. And also I wanted to help and support the staff and my organization as much as possible. We're not planning to stop despite all these regulations and restrictions, which are like this FARA, the grants law, the Russians law, and so on. We still continue to do the projects, many of them voluntarily. But yeah, on the sideline also, we mentioned the research, for example. We're now like doing some kind of research project with some of our international partners where I will get employed. And I also want to look at how, for example, authoritarian regimes emerged in different places, how they were defeated, how they were not defeated, what were the mistakes which happened. Because for me also at the moment, I constantly ask myself, what is the concrete tactical steps which we need to take in order to be more effective in fighting with authoritarianism. I see kind of strategic picture, but the tactical ways, it's hard for me to respond. So I want to research and look at it as well. I also love teaching, so I think I will go back and teach some classes at university. I also teach in school as well, because I always learn a lot from young generation. I always say that actually I learn more from them than they learn from me. So I teach Cambridge A-levels, business and economics, usually in some schools as well, so I'm going to be doing that as well. And also that helps, to get some finances and some resources, so then you can do volunteering, civil society work. So that's how I see it at the moment. Obviously trying not to get arrested, which is never the goal. Sometimes, if you look and read some comments from on the Medi page or something, those people say that, they want to get arrested. Nobody ever wants to get arrested.
It is becoming more and more difficult not to get arrested because,
But yes, I think that's, and another thing also, we do a lot of legal battles as well. At the moment, we have a lot of cases against these restrictions in Georgian Constitutional Court, which we don't really believe that would do anything at the moment, unfortunately. But also you need to go through this process to take it to European Court of Human Rights, which we do, and it already registered our case against FARA and grants law about 1 month ago. So we are looking forward to this litigation. We're also gonna do the same for immigrants restrictions. As you know, now Georgian immigration is banned from voting abroad by the new electoral code. So we're gonna also sue the regime for that, and the same with the protests, which is now basically crazy because you cannot even protest on the payments. Because my friends, when I talked to some of them read from, and they wrote for me from Oxford and asked like, Sandro, like, how are you guys gonna protest? I said, I don't know. Maybe we protest on the trees. I don't know, because if you ban it on the road, you ban it on the payment. Then, but I said, of course, we're gonna continue as we are, obviously, right? That's and that's what I'm also trying to do with my organization, and what what our team is trying to do. We're trying to continue doing the work which we were doing before all these restrictions happened. It's obviously increasingly challenging, hard, but we're trying at least not to live by the rules which we feel are unjust, and we're trying to continue doing the work which we're doing before. So that's my plans at the moment. Concerning politics, I never say never about this, but I also feel that at the moment the partisan politics is not that important in Georgian case. And some people disagree with me about it, but I feel like that I don't feel that there is, like, for example, at the moment necessity for new political parties or something. It shouldn't necessarily be political parties. It could be like just some movements and coordination. I think the people and individuals matter even more today than they were before, and this line between partisan politics, civil society, activism is very blurry, because when the authoritarianism and some form of dictatorship is strongly emerging in Georgia, we all need to fight. And I think you being an activist, a journalist, in general, if you believe in democracy and if you believe in the prosperity and Georgian prosperous future, you should be doing all you can to prevent it. And that's why I don't think that at the moment the party politics is the only way to do it.
Okay, so again, before we move to the geopolitics and zoom out a little bit, as you mentioned, feel free to comment on the current Georgian developments, like current Georgian politics. For example, what we see now is the biggest story is that it was a few days ago when Mr. Liluashvili was arrested, head of Georgia's State Security Service, former head of Georgia's State Security Service, one of the most powerful men after Bidzina, for example. The Georgian Dream is introducing this, the education reform, and they are boasting that, well, first time in the Georgian history, they are making, the higher education free, for example. But we know that there are a lot of things behind the wings that, and again, well, your opinion would be interested on this, the education reform. You're fresh from Oxford. Also, the overwhelming majority of the political leaders are in prison. So apart from, again, the repressions and the draconical laws that are being introduced. So we think things are moving backwards in a way. And at the same time, Georgian Dream speaking heads are, bashing the Western partners, attacking ambassadors. The other day I was scrolling down Papuashvili's Facebook page. And I'll tell you what, so, if you compare it to, I don't know, maybe Imedi or Postivi's Facebook page, it is way more anti-European. And, well, instead of, he calls himself, the president of the parliament, and his Facebook should show at least like, some of the new laws that were introduced, or some economic growth, or maybe meeting some of the leaders, etc. Instead of that, it says how bad Europe is, how bad the United Kingdom is, democratic world is. Again, feel free to comment on any of the current developments.
Yeah, to be brief, I think
Georgia,
with the Liluashvili case, the funniest story for me was that the current executive director of my organization, Marika Panadze, she was the lawyer of the Formula. And the case in which she was representing the Formula was that about 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, the Formula and also Tavari Arhi at that time, they did some investigations and some news coverage of so-called call centers, which were run by Liluashvili. And at that time, the government said that all of this is lies, that he was obviously not involved, and he sued the Formula and Tavari in the courts in a defamation case, saying that they lie. And the courts granted him in unprecedentedly fast. Like he managed to win the Tbilisi court, also appellate court and Supreme Court in just 14 months. And usually that never happens in Georgian courts, but he managed to win all these three cases. And at that time, the regime position was that there are no cases of call centers with Georgian Dream supporters there. And then suddenly yesterday they do a briefing when they say that Liluashvili was running call centers, and then that this call center was used to pay for opposition media and for for them not to cover this. And then I was like, okay, what kind of person should be who believes in that? Because it was so evident for me. But in general, I think the picture with this is that in general you can see that Ivanishvili is probably very upset that he cannot return some of his money from the Swiss banks and so on. So he is trying to control all the funds. I think he is probably a little bit paranoid about it. He's very afraid that some people who have some money can challenge him. So you can see that in many other cases, in Bachiashvili case,
absolutely,
in Liluashvili case. So when he's even in Haribashvili case, when he sees that some people are getting some resources, now he's trying to make them bring it back because he's afraid that at some point maybe they will fund some opposition, or maybe they would fund some critical media, or maybe they would fund some NGOs and so on. So I think that's the thing. About the education reform and it becoming free, it was also funny. I think the deputy chairman of the parliament, Volsky, said that before they criticize it, they should make it free in their countries first, or something like this. And he was responding to this, I think, to US or and to other professors.
Maybe that was the letter. 65 professors,
including many Oxford ones, who I know personally. And he was like, they should make it first free in US and in UK, and then they can criticize ours. But the thing is that, first of all, it's a good question how they're going to fund it. Because I looked at the numbers as an economist, and for example, the total grant funding for all Georgian students in 2025-26 year was just 46 million lari. So and then I calculated if, for example, you make it free for all students in all state universities of Georgia, and the amount was about almost 300 million lari. So they need to increase the funding of state universities 6 times, also canceling all the private university funding, which I think also one of the reasons why they do that, because they want to make universities like University of Georgia or Free University of Tbilisi less competitive and less attractive for students, because they don't control those universities, so it's a way to weaken them. But also, where do they bring this money from? Because then I looked at the budget for the next year and I don't see any additional funds allocated for it. So are they going to cut the amount of students in state universities? And that means cutting by 6 times, or what do they plan to do? So I think that's a big question to ask. And in general, this education reform, I think has these 2 major goals, right? One is to attack this private university, which is still don't control. And the second one is also to get rid of Ilya State University, which is the only state university, big one, which they also don't control and which has a strong political position about Georgia's European future and so on. So I think that's why they introduced this reform. And in general, it's in line with the overall trend, right? The overall trend is that the regime is trying to control what they call all free islands or free spaces in Georgian society, right? So, and it was very clear. I was telling the rectors of Free University and the University of Georgia already when the Russian law was being passed that you're one of the next. It's coming. You should get preparing for it, because it was obvious that the regime at some point would attack them. So that, I think, was the education part. Papuashvili case, I don't know. I think he's trying to beat Kobachidze maybe and shows that he's maybe better to Mr. Bidzina, that he's better, he can do everything, that there are no red lines for him, because it's crazy when you read it.
You said it, that's a competition.
Maybe. Or maybe I think it's also a freeway competition. Another one is Mr. Dinaradze, who is now doing all these fake investigations, and unfortunately Georgian security services became extremely partisan. It was already partisan, but now even in the narratives and in everything, it's super partisan. And in terms of the economy, I think it's also very important for Georgian people and for Georgian partners to understand, yes, overall economy of Georgia grows. If you look just at the standalone economic growth numbers, it's extraordinary, right? If you look at it, double digits and so on, I think every country ideally would wish for this. But then I think it's all about the devil is in details at the same point. If we did this study in 2023 and we looked at Georgian economic growth and its inclusivity, and at that time we find out that only 13% of Georgian population standard of living actually improved. So if you have a double-digit economic growth, it was extremely non-inclusive. To make it even simpler, the very rich became richer, the poor people became poorer, and for most people nothing changed, or even became poorer. So the standard of living doesn't improve. I actually want to do this study again, maybe sometime next year, to see what happened after 2023. But I think it's probably the same trend with this economy. And also the second point, very briefly, I think it's also very important to say that this economic growth is also partially very dependent on the economic activities with Georgian Dream and the business associated with them are doing because of the war in Ukraine. If you look at the Georgian exports, it's a fascinating number, and a lot of people and my colleagues ask me when they look at this shit, is Georgia producing any cars? That's one of the questions. They ask, is Georgia, do we have like any car manufacturing? And no, but the thing is that at the moment, 40% of Georgian export, it's crazy number.
Absolutely,
40% is re-exporting cars.
Kazakhstan.
And technically all these cars go to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, but the reality is if you go, and it's very easy, you can go and Google the statistical office of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, you'll realize that all these cars which leave Georgia, they never arrive to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and they all somehow emerge in Russia, right? So that's the reality when Georgia is kind of helping the Russia, which is now sanctioned. It's very hard for them to export cars, to get the luxury cars. If you look at the Porsche sales in Georgia, which I was looking, I think they're like 10 times more than last year, and especially its luxury segment and so on. And if you look at this Ferrari, which was opened recently, I think that probably also many of those Ferraris would end up in the Russian market as well. So I think that economy, yes, it's nominally growing, but what is more important for ordinary Georgian citizens is if their standard of living is improving or not. And the reality is that it's not improving. And I think that's also partially why the protest is not very inclusive. I think that's also a very interesting point to make, because the rich people are happy. So usually if you look at revolutions or big political changes, it's either the poor people who revolt or either the rich people who change something, do some kind of internal coup or something. So the very rich are very happy because they're becoming extremely rich. And then unfortunately the most poor people becoming even poorer, so they don't really have time to think about politics. For them it's what should I eat or what should I bring to the table for my children the next day. So they don't, and that's why our protest and our protest movement is at the moment predominantly as the middle class kind of educated people. And I think that needs to change also. Like going back to your question, we really need to involve the poorer segment of Georgian society. Many of those people also live in villages and small towns outside of Tbilisi, and we need to work with those people. They need to understand that the hardships which they have, that there's worsening standard of living is coming from the government policies, and what should get an alternative, what should be done for this to change. And I think that's for the opposition and entire how European even integration will solve their problems. It's very important for them to understand, because this economy is again benefiting GD, because the richer are becoming richer, they're not going to revolt and fight, and the poorer are becoming poorer, which also makes it much harder for them to do any political activity and to get involved and to protest and do something like that.
Yeah, to dig into the economy again, and I think you rightly mentioned that this double-digit growth, which is not obviously inclusive, well, that's it's key result of the war economy. Okay, the sanctions on Russia and Russia circumnavigating the sanctions by the help of Georgia. And but even those double-digit numbers are cooling down. I think in 2025 we won't have double-digit growth. We will have 6 points, I don't know, something
around 7%.
Around 7%. But look, the Georgian economy before, it has never been the locked economy or isolated economy. And when Georgia is being isolated, how it is isolated now, and the Western aid is stopped for sure, and again this war economy is cooling down. What is the future of Georgia's economy in isolation?
Yeah.
And also I'll ask the next question about geopolitics, and you can answer them together, because I think economy is linked with geopolitics, obviously. And what is the future of the increasingly authoritarian Georgia in light of again, United States, the Trump's USA pulling out of European security architecture, war. Of course, I mean, there are some signs of possible agreement, but I don't expect any peace agreement anytime soon. So the war is going to continue. I mean, the Georgian government will become more and more isolated. I don't think that China and some of the other neighbors are increasingly interested in Georgia. Georgia is off European Union's enlargement agenda. And even more, I think that Georgia sees European Union as a hostile, the bloc. And Georgia is falling out with Armenia and Azerbaijan, and this is what we see unfolding now. So what is the future of Georgia in this kind of situation, and what is the future of Georgia's economy, and what does it mean for a regular Georgian, not for the extremely rich, not extremely poor, but something in the middle, which I think should make a change?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, first of all, you mentioned very important point that Georgia is a small, open economy, and always been. And also, it doesn't have the capacity. Georgia would not be able to become some kind of Iran. Right, the Georgia economy would never be able to be self-sufficient. It has to be integrated into neighboring economies and to global economy. So I think the Ivanishvili regime kind of understands that, because they try, but it's unsuccessfully. But they try to do some more business with China, which is not happening. But they still try. You can see they try to do something with Arab world as well, which also is not really probably which would sell the Georgian economy. But yes, for sure, I think with certainty you can say that Georgia would not survive as a closed, isolated economy. That would be devastating, and that would definitely result in a regime change. And I think the regime probably understands that. And going into the geopolitics part, I think, yes, at the moment, if you look at many different cards, as Donald Trump likes to say, they're not really in favor of Georgia in many ways. For example, U.S. foreign policy is fundamentally shifted. We all seen the new foreign policy strategy or doctrine, which Trump recently published. But at the same time, if you look, for example, in our region, right, the Trump did these big deals in Central Asia with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and all the STAN countries. And I think the major reason for these big deals was to create an alternative source of minerals, which U.S. needs to produce the microchips, because at the moment they're very China dependent. And that's why, for example, Trump had to do a deal with China, because if he's without these minerals, which they need to produce the microchips, the American economy is going to go into recession. Everyone knows it. So for him, alternative is the Central Asia. But then the big question is, how do you transport these minerals from Central Asia to Europe and to America, and how do you start producing? And I think that's where there's importance for Georgian economy, and that's also the part which we can work with American administration, because yes, obviously Trump also, I think very smartly from this perspective, did the Azerbaijan-Armenia deal and created the so-called this Trump route for prosperity, or this corridor between Azerbaijan and Turkey through Armenia. But I think it's would be very naive, and I think Americans are not that naive to just count on that, because situation is very fragile. You never know what can happen in Armenia. I hope that they continue on their democratization European path, but you never know what kind of things can change in Armenia. We've seen that in Georgia in 2012, right, when the regime may change. And I think just to bet all of this multi-billion-dollar enterprise of these minerals, and in a way it's a future for American economy as well. It's really necessary for them, for all this AI-related technology,
which drives the markets and
which drives the markets
economy,
at the moment. So I think it would be very foolish for Trump to bet just on this Azerbaijan-Armenia corridor. I think he really needs Georgia for that as well. Also, the Anaklia port comes into play in this, because and so on. So I think that's something which Georgia has to offer, and going further to your question, if you look the trade disputes and the problems with this current Georgian regime is creating for Azerbaijan-Armenia trade, I think it's very easy and very straightforward to conclude that obviously the Russia is not happy about it. The Russia is, and the Georgian regime probably going to do many things to stall this process. And I think that's why it's very important for Trump to have the kind of political regime in Georgia which would enable and at least be a backup plan to Azerbaijan, Armenia. And in reality, I think Georgia is even easier because infrastructure is already here. Maybe it's not perfect, but at least we have highways and stuff. To do this corridor from Azerbaijan to Turkey through Armenia, you need to invest a lot of money and it will take years. So I think in this perspective, US needs Georgia, and we need to be more pragmatic. Maybe the democracy and human rights are less so on the agenda of American foreign policy at the moment, but we can do some things like that. And I think it also comes the same with Europeans. And in general, I think the Bidzina's bet probably, when I was thinking about it, was that he can be some kind of, there are a lot of authoritarian countries around us, right? Some of our neighbors as well. And And he said, maybe I could also be one of them. They need me for this transit. Maybe he was also betting on some north to south transit also, from Russia to Iran and so on, possibly, but also through this east to west transit. And he said, okay, maybe because of this, I would survive. I can become authoritarian and they would not punish me. Look, there are other ones who are surviving. But I think what's his major problem is that, first of all, when you are under the Russian some kind of influence, the Russia doesn't like this, and then he's basically under two fires, right? One, if you try and do some kind of this trade, good relations with the West, then Russia is angry, and I think he's clearly afraid of Russia or controlled by Russia. And then the second part is so he's not a reliable partner. A lot of our Western allies already 2 or 3 or even 4 times he promised things which he never did and changed his mind and so on. So it's very hard to trust Bidzina for them. So I think that's one of the selling points which we should have. And geopolitically, yes, the situation with US, it's understandable. But again, I think even like with the UK, I always try to look forward. For example, at the moment, if you look in UK politics, the Reform Party is number one. And and I'm also trying to be pragmatic about it. There is a high chance that they may come to power. And maybe at some point, maybe Nigel Farage becomes prime minister. It's hard for many people to understand, but also I think we should be pragmatic as a small Georgian state. It's small in terms of like size, but we should also be trying to building some relations with them as well. I think one of the big mistakes which Georgian civil society opposition made was not to build closer ties with Trump people in advance. Now there are some efforts to work with the American administration, but this should have been done before Trump won the election and should have been done more proactively. And I think it's the same, for example, should be done with the Reform Party, because if they come, for example, to power in UK, it's very UK foreign policy is important for Georgia. But my point is that we should be working with those people as well and building some ties.
Yeah,
maybe the red line should be them being pro-Russian, clearly defined pro-Russian. But if you look at the Reform Party, even like they're technically at least pro-Ukrainian. They never publicly say that they're against pro-Ukraine. So my point is that we should like look at this geopolitics also in advance. Then these things which happen to us, we don't suddenly happen to them. So we should be prepared for them. The same, for example, with USAID. I think it was very clear that at some point this would have happened, because if you look at the public support in US for USAID, it was dropping. And I was looking at this foreign aid. Actually, my thesis in Oxford was about how foreign aid is effectively could be used for democratization in different countries. And when you looked at the poll numbers, USAID was going down, and down. And it already happened in US history before, like during the World War I, during the Great Depression, and so on, when US kind of pulled all these resources and went to isolationist mode. So it was like clear. And also USAID is the easiest target, because the average American doesn't really feel what it is doing. So it was very easy to dismantle it. It would be, for example, very hard to dismantle the Department of Agriculture or Department of some Commerce or something, which give a lot of grants to Americans, which you can fill their presence. But USAID, they're sending some money abroad. And there's a funny fact, for example, in the poll numbers, if you ask an average American, how much do you think of our budget is spent on USAID? They would say about 10%. And then they will ask them, how much do you think should be spent? They would say like 5%. And then the reality was 0.2 or 0.3. So, but that was the perception. So I was seeing this coming, maybe not under Trump, but somebody else. And I think, again, we didn't prepare. Like that's my big point with the Georgian civil society, which was heavily dependent. So my point with this reform and stuff, I think we should be preparing for the worst scenarios. That's basically what I'm saying. They may not win, obviously, but if they do, we should be ready for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Is there anything else? I mean, it's very interesting, to be honest, and we could continue talking until cows come home, but we have to say goodbye to our viewers at some point. So is there anything that you would like to add to this podcast?
Yeah, I think I would... First of all, thank you again for this very insightful conversation. I think I would ask our viewers, and I think many of them are also people who live abroad, to think what they can do to save Georgian democracy and how they can support us. I think that's very important because Georgian people are unprecedentedly fighting for it. The protests are lasting more than 1 year. I don't think that we have any such case anywhere in the world. I was looking. It's a constant, non-stop protests. And also specifically to our American friends. The Georgia, I think, is the only or one of the very few countries in the world. And I realized that when I was in Oxford, which is overwhelmingly pro-American. The Georgian society is overwhelmingly pro-American and pro-European. And especially for Americans, there are not many countries like that. If you look on all the global South and South, it's extremely anti-American thing. So besides the pragmatic view, I think it's also very important for them not to lose an ally. And Georgia is an easy one for them, which is willing to do. I think there are very few countries in the world which, for example, would willingly accept an American military base in their country, and Georgia is one of them, potentially. Right. So that's why you should look at Georgia as a partner which is united with you in values, which also shares a lot of common things with you, and which is also ready to sacrifice and fight. And we showed it through our campaign in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We supported Americans there. So don't abandon us in this fight. I think that's very important for our friends. And think how you can support and contribute to, because Georgia is the front line of this fight between freedom and authoritarianism. And if the freedom falls in Georgia or in Ukraine, then there are going to be next countries which come next, and please don't make that happen.
Thank you, Sandro, for this very insightful conversation. Thank you for watching us and listening to us. By the way, I would like to wish you a very happy Christmas and a fulfilling New Year, and I'll see you in 2026.